A very good evening. Well, tonight marks a year since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. The conflict has cost tens of thousands of lives, reawakened fears of a general, perhaps even nuclear war in Europe, and created political and economic instability that has been felt right around the world. Well, we've been asking for your questions all day about the war, what's happening on the ground, what will happen next, how might it all end? And throughout this hour, we're going to be putting some of them, there have been many, many of them, to our Defence and Security Analyst, Professor Michael Clarke. Very good evening to you, Michael, once again. And before we get into those questions, just a quick thought, Michael, on the first anniversary of the war, which, of course, originally Putin thought would be the first anniversary, more or less, of him taking Ukraine and Kiev.
Absolutely, yeah. 3 days to take Ukraine, get rid of Zelensky, kill him, get rid of the government. All over by about March the 8th, where they'd be in control of the big cities, and then just sitting on Ukraine as a new constitutional arrangement for Russia. The world changed this time a year ago. Europe certainly changed, and I've always said there's no hiding from this, there's no turning back. This is a new security situation. We've got to live with it. It'll be risky, and there's nothing we can do to pretend we can go back to where we were.
Well, let's look to the future and not necessarily an enticing outlook through the questions and dig straight into them. Yep. So, Michael, deal with this one from Nick, first of all, to kick us off. Could Russia attack Ukraine with new weapons systems on the first anniversary of the start of the war? Now, these are the weapon systems that Putin claims he has and wanted to test, didn't he, on the day that Biden was in Kiev?
Yeah, he was talking about his hypersonic missiles that he was talking about today, the Zircon anti-ship missile, and they've got the Kinzhal air-launched hypersonic missile. They won't, I don't think. What I think they may do is launch the 15th big air offensive. There have been 14 waves where they've launched more than 1,000 missiles and drones to really hit the infrastructure. They might do that again in the next 24, 48 hours. My guess will be they would. I've got no information that they will, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do. New weapons are not... There's something that Putin pretends he's got lots of in order to frighten the West that the war is getting worse and worse. But actually, he's doing his worst as it is until this new offensive begins, this offensive which I think hasn't really started yet.
So he's saying he doesn't actually have them. I mean, we know towards the end of the Second World War with the Nazis, it was wonder weapons, wasn't it, that would save...
Yeah, the V1s, the V2s, exactly. And if they'd arrived earlier, they'd have made a difference to the war, but they didn't, thankfully, as well as nuclear weapons, which the Germans were working on. However, I mean, what the Russians have got, they've got these systems which are relevant to a US-Russia global war, which would be used in an all-out nuclear exchange or something like that. But we're not remotely near that at the moment. He pretends that we're going down that road. We're not. OK, well, Brian asks the follow-up question very nicely for us. Brian says, what can we expect then from the long-awaited Russian offensive? And that is expected. Some say it's kind of building up now. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the offensive has started yet. Some people say it has. And if this is the offensive, then it's not very good. I mean, they're not achieving very much. What I think they will try to do is take the whole of the Donbass, and that is plausible from their point of view. If it goes really well for the Russians, I think they'll take the Donbass, they'll strengthen the land bridge from the Donbass to Crimea and then west again to Kherson, and maybe go for Odessa a second time, if it went well. If it went really, really well, they might then try to push north from Zaporizhia up the Dnieper River in order to split Ukraine into a third, two-thirds, into one-third to the east, two-thirds to the west. That was a plausible strategic objective when we thought the Russians might be capable of doing something like that a year ago. But that would be the very best that they could hope for in this offensive.
OK, well, take that on board. You've painted some of the possibilities there. And Dan asks this, really asking you to focus then, well, where do you think, given their resources mixed with their ambitions, the next big Russian push will be? Where?
Logically, it has to be in the Donbass, because that's what they want. That's Putin's minimal requirement. He said he's changed his war aims all the time, but the last set of war aims he came up with is that we have to protect the Russian speakers in the Donbass, etc., etc. So they want to take all of the Donbass. When this offensive really starts, I suspect we'll see it in 4 or 5 areas, because they'll want to try to stretch the Ukrainians by giving them something to worry about near Kiev, maybe going toward Kharkiv again, maybe even moving westwards toward Lviv. These will be, operations intended, in a sense, to give the Ukrainians something else to bother about. But what they'll really want is that area that you see the shading there at sort of 3 o'clock on the clock. If you think of Ukraine as a sort of an oval clock, there at 3 o'clock, that's the Donbass. And if they can take the whole of the Donbass, draw a line in your mind from Kharkiv right down to, if you like, Kherson, down in the southwest. If they could take that, then Putin would say, well, yeah, I've protected the Russian speakers. That's a big ask even so. But I think when this offensive starts, I think we'll see it in several places because they'll want to try to split Ukrainian forces.
And so is that why, let's look in the middle of that Donbass region there, Bakhmut.
Yeah.
Is that why the fighting there has been so fierce and taken such
Not
a long
really.
time? Ewan asks, how important is Bakhmut for the Russians?
The answer is not very. I mean, Bakhmut's been the focus for the last 3 months by the Wagner Group. This is the private military company that run by Prigozhin. And Prigozhin's at war with the Kremlin. He's at war with Gerasimov, and he's at war with Shoigu, the defense minister. And Prigozhin is trying to prove that only he and the Wagner Group can do something, whereas the Russian military has been failing everywhere else in the theatre, but he, the Wagner Group, can take Bakhmut. They thought they'd take it easily. Even today, he was publicly arguing on Telegram that he said they're keeping us short of artillery. They're deliberately, the Russian military, are deliberately keeping us short of artillery, so we can't take Bakhmut. It's become a personal crusade of his to take this place.
But what kind of manpower is he expending? We're hearing of horrendous losses.
Yeah, well, they had about 10,000 Wagner mercenaries in theatre, and those are all ex-soldiers who knew what they were doing. I mean, they were very brutal people. But they had up to another 40,000, some said 50,000 convicts that they recruited from the prisons. And they've been dying in very high numbers because they're put in the front line. I mean, the deal that Prigozhin gave them, and we've got testimony of him doing this, we've got pieces of film of him doing this. He gets everybody together in these prisons, he has done, and he said, it's like something out of the Dirty Dozen, literally. He said, only God will get you out of this prison, but I can get you out today. If you sign up, you'll get good food, you get training, and we will put you on the front line. If you disobey an order, or if you withdraw, we'll shoot you, straight off, out of hand. If you're still alive at the end of 6 months, you're free. Now, that's what he said. They recruited 40,000 prisoners that way, but A, they were getting shot for all sorts of reasons, and B, they didn't keep to their end of the bargain, because at the end of 6 months, a lot of them were made to sign on again, or they just kept there. And so they're not now recruiting from the prisons because the prisons don't want to go.
And on the issue of Bakhmut, Paul asks, could Ukraine encircle Bakhmut by retreating and then launching a counterattack from the north and the south? We might have to have a look at the map again.
Yeah, the answer is not at the moment, but Paul is onto something there, because when the Ukrainians are able to get their act together with the equipment that they're getting from the West and their reorganisation, we will see a war of manoeuvre. This hasn't been a war of manoeuvre so far. The Russians are not very good at manoeuvring. They move in big numbers and they gradually go forward. The Ukrainians, too, have been fairly static. They've been a lot cleverer than the Russians, but they haven't had the equipment to manoeuvre. As and when they get these Western tanks operational, and that will be some time, and organised for it, if they can put together 2 really good armoured brigades, which means 100 tanks in each brigade, say, then we'll see some arrows on the map going quite quickly. And so what Paul was saying is that can the Ukrainians do it now? No, they can't. Could they do it in 2 or 3 months' time? Maybe. Because I think when the Ukrainians get moving, we'll see them move fast if they're able to use this Western equipment in the way that it is intended.
And just, we haven't got them on the map there. You can tell us where they are, Michael. Tim asks, why are Kramatorsk and Sloviansk so important?
If you go westwards from Bakhmut, so if you go round about, see the M in Bakhmut, if you sort of put a couple of blobs on there, north and south, that is the northern one is Sloviansk and the southern one is Kramatorsk. And those are both important, because if the Russians get Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, then they will get the rest of the Donbass, because they get the rail links, particularly from Kramatorsk. But the Ukrainians have made Sloviansk and Kramatorsk into fortresses. They're on high ground. There's a lot of water between Bakhmut and Sloviansk, because it's a very watery area there. And so even if the Russians get Bakhmut, which they may, I think they've almost encircled it, and I think the Ukrainians will probably have to withdraw. Getting that relatively short distance from Bakhmut to Sloviansk Kramatorsk will be tough, and the Ukrainians will make it very tough for them. So an even bigger battle would come if the Russians are able to do that.
Well, Alexander, our next questioner, asks something following on from that. If the Russian offensive fails badly, as you're saying, is a possibility there, and the Western armoured vehicles arrive, would the Ukrainians have the capacity to retake their territory? What difference would those tanks in particular make?
Huge difference, yeah. So the answer is yes. They certainly will, and it's certainly what they intend to do. And as I say, if we go back to manoeuvre, if we're going to see a war of manoeuvre now that the Ukrainians are able to use, and the Russians are very poor at manoeuvre so far, then we'll see quite a lot of changes to that map. That map hasn't changed very much in months when you just look at it. We've been putting up the same map at Sky News and talking about little bits of it around the edges. If the Ukrainians can get their act together by April or May, we'll start to see that map change. Yes, they can retake territory. How much territory will depend.
OK, well, weaponry crucial there, as you're mentioning, Michael. Yeah. So let's talk about weaponry now and how it affects our own security in the UK and the West. Whitehall sources have told Sky News that the UK is reviewing the size of its ammunition stockpiles because Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown them to be far too small. Our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, reports.
Western weapons in eastern Ukraine. They're evening up the battlefield for Ukrainian troops against Russia's much larger army. But neither side's stocks are finite. And a race is on to see who can rearm fastest. On Ukraine's front line near the city of Bakhmut, a soldier explains how this makeshift cover protects his gun from Russian suicide drones. He also talks about the need to preserve ammunition.
Амуніція вона так як є, а сили і засоби ми, звичайно, що бережемо. Десь трошки менше стріляємо. Але загалом завдання, які поставлені для нашого виконання, ми робимо.
Yet the rate of artillery fire over the past year has been greater than at any time since the Korean War. A Ukrainian officer has told Sky News that Russia had been firing 60,000 to 70,000 shells a day, a level that's about halved as supplies ran down. US officials have put that top rate at around 20,000 a day, but also say it's dropped. Ukraine, by contrast, has been firing 5,000 to 6,000 rounds daily. As for the impact, Russia has lost around 9,000 pieces of military equipment, such as armoured vehicles and artillery, 3 times more than Ukraine. With its tanks, missiles and generosity, the UK is one of the Ukrainian military's most important suppliers. But for how long? I've been told Britain is reviewing the size of its ammunition stockpiles because Russia's invasion here has exposed how past assumptions on what would be needed to fight a war were far too conservative. My sources say Rishi Sunak must increase defence spending to fund a massive expansion in ammunition and weapons stores, or risk being unable to keep supporting Ukraine at the level needed. Rebuilding the UK's military strength after decades of cuts is also critical. The Prime Minister talked tough when he hosted Vladimir Zelensky this month. But one Whitehall source accused Mr Sunak of having no interest in defence and security. Those charged with that in number 10 can barely get access to him. The President Zelensky visit was engaged with late and with only peripheral, passing interest. If it's not domestic or economic, it doesn't feature. A second source said, he's a financier and simply can't understand these things. A government spokesperson said, these claims are baseless and untrue. It was the Prime Minister who, as Chancellor, agreed the 2020 spending review that provided the Ministry of Defence with the largest increase in defence investment since the Cold War. The Prime Minister is clear that we will do everything necessary to protect our people, which is why our armed forces will always have the equipment and capability they need. Of course, the UK is only one of many countries arming Ukraine, but dwindling stockpiles is a common theme that needs fixing, so the troops can keep firing. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Kyiv.
Well, my colleague Mark Austin earlier asked the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson about what difference greater Western support could make to Ukraine.
Do not underestimate what the Ukrainians can do. They kicked him out of the Kiev area where you are now. They kicked him out of the Kharkiv area. They kicked him out of Kherson. If they have the right kit, so if they have the deep fires, the long-range artillery, if they have enough tanks, we need to give them more tanks. And yes, if they have planes to take out those Russian artillery positions, Russian command and control as well, then I've got no doubt that President Zelensky's armed forces can recapture their territory.
Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson there on his view. No doubt that Western weaponry will continue to make a difference to Ukraine. And we've got Professor Michael Clarke here with me, as you know, answering your questions about all that. And Tenari asks this one, Michael. Will this new supplement of Western weapons make a difference, and how quickly does it need to arrive? And can I add in, you know, what does it need to be? We talked about tanks, there's aircraft on the list, but as the former Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, was saying there as well, the long-range artillery.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything, really. I mean, tanks themselves are the centrepiece, but you've got to have enough armoured fighting vehicles to go with them, and armoured infantry vehicles and artillery that can move, because it's all got to move together. It's combined arms. This is what the Russians are so hopeless at doing, though they talk it, but they don't do it. The Ukrainians are doing it, but if they can do it with our equipment, they'll do it as well as a NATO army would do it, which is to bring tanks, armoured vehicles, infantry, artillery and air power all together into one big arrow on the map that moves, manoeuvre warfare again, that really and if you put that together, it cut through pretty well anything the Russians have got. Now, can they do it? Well,
we have to have the training to do that as well,
takes
don't
time.
you?
That's the point.
Are they getting it?
They are, but it takes time, and they learn quick, for sure, and they are learning quickly, but also they've got to reorganise themselves. I mean, fighting a defensive war, as they have done, dynamic defence, they did really well. That's quite different to fighting an offensive war. You've got to organise differently, think differently. You've got to actually have a different command and control system. So are they capable of doing all of that? Yes. The danger for them is that they go a little bit early before they're fully formed into armoured brigades that can make a difference, and they squander it. And there may be a temptation to use some of this stuff in defence. If the Russians start to push them hard in the Donbass, in Zaporizhia, they might find they're deploying bits of this stuff, these equipments and new organisations at lower levels just to hold the Russians back. That would be a shame if they have to do that. And I'm sure at the moment they're playing for time. The Ukrainians are on the defensive now in the Donbass in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and they're buying time. And they are literally, as soldiers sometimes do, they're giving their lives to buy time so that people elsewhere are training for the offensive, which they confidently believe they'll be able to launch sometime later spring, early summer.
Sounds pretty finely balanced.
Yeah.
Richard's got a question specifically again about tanks. And I suppose, you know, one thought perhaps 10, 15 years ago that kind of tanks had their day. And Richard asks, why have tanks continued to play a significant role in the conflict, given the degree of long-range artillery and air power? Can't they be picked off?
No. I once said years ago to a British cavalry officer, said, how are you getting on with the idea of the passing of the tank? And he said, oh, for God's sake, don't say that. We're still getting over the passing of the horse, which in the British cavalry was sort of true. However, no, tanks are a way of creating mobility and firepower. So the tank carries a gun and other machine guns. It's protected and it's mobile. Now, by itself, it can be very vulnerable, particularly to air power. But if it's accompanied by things that can protect it, then it's still the best way of punching holes in any defence on the battlefield. And the modern tank, the Leopard 2 or the Challenger 2 or the American Abrams, is still doing the basic job that First World War tanks did, first on the Somme in 1916 and then in Cambrai in 1917. They were great tractors with big guns on the side of them, and they were crude and they broke down, but it's the same job that they do. But these days, they're part of a sophisticated combined arms operation, and the tank is not passing at all, but it's changing. And the things that need to go with the tank are changing, and the roles that tanks can play is changing. But, you know, anyone who thinks that you can get by without tanks in any normal, traditional sort of warfare is going to be very rudely interrupted.
And what about ammunition, not just for tanks, but in particular for the big guns as well? Gary asks, how much will Ukraine's lack of access to plentiful artillery shells, how will that affect the outcome of the war? Is this one of the crucial elements?
Yeah, they inherited all this 122mm Soviet stuff, Russian stuff as well, and they've used up a lot of that. As they've been getting more Western systems, Western artillery, Western systems are 155 artillery shells, a little bit bigger. That's the base, that's the circumference, sorry, the diameter of the base of the shell. And they're restocking with 155 artillery. Potentially, there's quite a lot of it around, of course, but the Americans, on their behalf, are scouring the world for 122mm stuff that countries have got from the old Soviet Union, they've still got. Because artillery shells, if they've been properly stored, are OK for 30 or 40 years, if they've been properly stored. But increasingly, the Ukrainians need the 155 NATO standard artillery, because those are the sorts of artillery guns that they're being given and using. And for sure, I mean, there's millions of artillery shells around in the world, but they are using them up faster than they are being produced. And the Americans have just put in an order for their own artillery. They've increased their normal annual order by 4 times, fourfold increase in the next 5 years, because they've realised that you need an awful lot more artillery than you thought you did even 2 years ago.
And that's the question, then, how much is left for those nations that are donating those
That's
shells?
right. And nations are falling...
Are we now unprotected ourselves?
For sure. Yeah, for sure. And Ben Wallace, the MOD has put money aside for war stocks, just for artillery, because we've given the Ukrainians quite a lot of what we've got, and we've got very little ourselves. And so it's more important that Ukraine gets it at the moment, for sure. But we've all got to restock. And one of the arguments that we know that Ben Wallace, or we believe, I should say, Ben Wallace is having with Downing Street, is that our war stocks are so low that our forces are not credible. Our allies and our adversaries, they know that our forces look really good on paper. They've got the best equipment, the best troops, the best training. If you run out of ammunition in a week, which we would if we were fighting for Ukraine, then you lose. You know, and if we were fighting at the intensity the Ukrainians are fighting, we would run out of ammunition in about a week. So however brave you are, however well-trained you are, you lose.
Well, what about the really high-tech stuff? We heard President Zelensky, didn't we, not so very far away from here, asking directly for aircraft, for fighter jets. And Scott asks, if we supply jets to Ukraine, do they have the pilots to fly them, and how long would it take to train them on these unfamiliar aircraft? It's not just about the kit, is it?
No,
it's having the expertise to use it.
Depends on the pilots. Of course, I mean, Ukrainian pilots who have got combat experience on their own MiG-29s, the RAF estimates privately that they could train those up onto a modern aircraft, into our aircraft, if we were to give them our aircraft, or American aircraft, or Swedish Gripens are probably the best. They could do it in probably a month or 6 weeks. If it was a pilot without combat experience, you might be talking about a couple of months or 3 months. If it's somebody you've got to train to be a pilot, I mean, we spend 3 years training pilots, and we don't train nearly enough. You could probably do it in a year. Because the Ukrainians learn fast, and they've got an incentive to squeeze the whole training program in and work 18 hours a day if they need to. So, yes, we could train up Ukrainian pilots, and Britain is committed to do that. I mean, we haven't got any aircraft to give, in all honesty. Mm-hmm. We'd have to give them the whole of the Air Force, such as it now is. We've got seven fast jet squadrons, 7. You know, in the Gulf War in 1991, we had 19 squadrons. Now we've got 7. Mm. So we could give them the whole Air Force. It still wouldn't be enough. So we've got no aircraft to give in reality.
And Michael, what about, I mean, we're talking personnel there and training. It's not, of course, just the pilots. You know, OK, they're responsible when it's in the air, but it's getting it into the air and keeping it able to fly. What about the ground crews, the training they require? And, of course, where would they be positioned if they're supplied by the UK, by NATO countries?
Really good point, because Western aircraft are very complex, so they need quite a complex ground crew, and therefore you need to concentrate resources, these very technical resources, in 1 or 2 bases. But if you're in a war, you've got to have a number of bases. You've got to spread your air force out so it's not easily targetable. So you need lots of backup and support spread across a big area. We don't do that because in NATO over the last 40 years we've concentrated for efficiency, which it is more efficient in peacetime, on some big bases with some real specialists. But, you know, you need a lot more than that. So giving aircraft to Ukraine requires giving them air support, which is a whole lot of things, a bit like tanks, but even more complex than just the aircraft.
OK, Michael, well, one of the reasons that some countries have been hesitant about giving Ukraine tanks and fighter jets and the rest is, of course, because they fear the risk of escalation, how Russia might react to that. Well, let's talk about it all now, because it's an issue that was put to Boris Johnson by Mark Austin earlier.
What are the consequences, though, of failure, in your view?
I think the consequences of any kind of Putin victory, any kind of... there's a couple of things. First of all, he's able to continue to threaten not just Ukraine, but Georgia, Moldova, the Baltic states, Poland, anywhere on the vast periphery of the former Soviet empire. Don't forget, this is what this is all about. He was never really threatened by Ukraine as a potential NATO member. There was no question of establishing NATO missiles on Ukrainian soil, any of that nonsense. This has purely been done by Putin to bolster his flagging position at home and to try to reconstitute the old Soviet empire.
Mr. Johnson there with his analysis of Russian ambitions. And Borges asks this, Mr. Johnson there mentioning Belarus to the north of Ukraine and a loyal Russian ally. He asks, if Belarus enters the war, will other European countries join in as well? In response, I mean, this is all about NATO getting drawn in.
I mean, no, I'm sure is the answer. I think it's very unlikely that Belarus will enter the war in any significant way. President Lukashenko in Belarus is his own position is not great in terms of his domestic support. The war is very unpopular in Belarus, and the Belarusians really don't want to get engaged. Their army is extremely small. They claim to have an army of 50,000. Nobody believes that. They could probably put 15,000 into the field, and they're not very well trained, not very well equipped. But Belarus can, because it's got a long border with Ukraine, their border is useful to Russia, and Russia has sent Russian troops into Belarus to pose the possibility that they might cross the border again and start to go for Kiev. As it happens, there are some Belarusian troops fighting in Ukraine. There's about 2 battalions fighting for the Ukrainians, Belarusian volunteers, and they fight for the other side. So, no, I mean, Belarus is not a serious... It's a complication, but it's not a serious military threat. And if Belarus was foolish enough to enter the war, and I think Lukashenko would be lucky to survive if he did, but if he, you know, if they did, other states would just take it on the chin. They wouldn't react. They wouldn't invade because of it. No.
You kind of answered the next question from Rich, which is, again, about Belarus. Is it going to be the next excuse to expand Putin's efforts under the guise of a threat to Belarus by the Ukrainians? Well, it kind of already is under Russian control, isn't it?
There is a report moving around, which we're not sure if it's genuine, but there's no reason why it won't be genuine, which is a Russian strategic position paper on Putin's desire to take over Belarus by 2030. Now, that may not turn out to be genuine, but if it isn't genuine, it ought to be, because it's exactly what he wants to do. I mean, he wants to recreate the old Russian Empire of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and there's no argument about it. He said it on many occasions.
And Ukraine's central to that.
Absolutely. Ukraine is central, and so is Belarus. I mean, Belarus was the old Belarusia, it's white Russia, as was. So the idea that Putin has it in mind that to manipulate events so that by 2030 he takes over Belarus into a new sort of the Russian Federation is entirely plausible. Whether the report that's kicking around now is genuine or not, I don't know. But yes, that's quite likely in his mind.
OK, and Michael, Moldova's very interesting in all this in terms of expansion. Chris asks, is there a danger of Moldova being destabilised by Russia? No, that was Rich's question. We've moved on to Chris's. It doesn't matter. We'll get the map back up and just show everyone where Moldova is. Moldova sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine. It's landlocked. And Transnistria, that region, is very important within Moldova.
That's right. Yeah, it's the smallest state in Europe. Very weak. It's very small, very weak. There it is. I mean, between Ukraine and Romania, traditionally part of Romania. It has in it Transnistria, which is the Dniester River, which runs through it down to the Black Sea. And the area of Transnistria includes an enclave of Russian-speaking nationalists. It's actually the base of the old 14th Army. The Red Army, 14th Army used to be in Moldova. And a lot of retired officers are there with their families and so on. And so this country of, 3.5, 4 million people has got about 500,000 who are Transnistrians who demand or require or ask for unity with Russia. It used to be called Bessarabia. I'm recalling my old A-level history now. Bessarabia is part of Romania. However, I mean, Moldova itself, there was an attempt last weekend at a coup. In effect, on Sunday last week, the Russian minority called a demonstration to complain about the government because, as it happens, the Transnistria area provides all the power for the rest of Moldova, just because they're on the river. They actually have a lot of Russian aid. I mean, a lot of Russian stuff goes into there. And they tried to create a demonstration to remove the government, which is a very pro-Western government led by a very pro-Western Prime Minister and President. And it failed. It was a pretty miserable demonstration. But clearly it was inspired by Moscow. It was aided by Moscow. They thought they'd get, 100,000 people on the street. They seemed to get about 10,000 at most.
OK, got to take a break now, Michael. Thank you for that so far. You're watching Sky News tonight, a special question and answer session on Ukraine with Professor Michael Clarke. Now, coming up in this, we'll address the most common question that everyone's been sending in. The big question, will this all end in World War III? Stay with us.
The press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
There's a feeling amongst some commentators that it's not the most respectful timing.
I think there's a word for it, fake news.
I mean, it's wah, wah, wah from Harry.
Delving deeper into the stories with different perspectives on tomorrow's headlines.
We really haven't seen the government getting round the table and negotiating. There are no easy answers to those questions.
The press preview delivering you tomorrow's news tonight on Sky News.
Independent, United Kingdom.
These last few years have seen some huge stories. And these stories have been driven by politics, by politicians, the people in power.
You must stay at home.
And it's my job to figure out how these decisions made by politicians impact all of us in our everyday lives.
This is the worst thing I've ever been through in my life.
People turn up here with their child stuff in a black sack and just say, I don't want to.
And that is what it is. It's first-class poverty.
Is this an example of the welfare state failing?
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
These are stories that affect us all. Millions of children are now having to catch up. Some stories have changed all of our lives. Because like the residents, the staff are being infected. Politicians, they make decisions all of the time, and it's our job to hold them to account. I wonder if you will take this opportunity to apologise to those families. But in the end, the real power doesn't actually lie with the politicians. The real power lies with the people. I'm Nick Martin. I'm the People and Politics correspondent at Sky News.
Welcome back. We're answering your questions about the war in Ukraine as we approach exactly 1 year since the Russian invasion began. Professor Michael Clarke is still here with me answering those questions. So we're going to turn now to the issue and the role of China. Now, earlier Mark Austin asked the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson for his views about a possible Chinese intervention.
What would the consequences be, do you think, if China actively supported Russia in this war by supplying weaponry?
I think it would be a historic mistake by the Chinese. I was very concerned to see what Wang Yi was doing yesterday in Moscow. I think, you know, it would be a big mistake. Why does China want to be contaminated by association with Putin, who's revealed himself to be this gangster and adventurer? I think it would be a big mistake by China. But what it shows is the urgency of us giving the Ukrainians what they need to succeed this year.
Well, Boris Johnson's saying that any Chinese intervention would be a historic mistake. And Brian has sent in a question asking that very question. What can we expect China's next move to be in the conflict? They appear to be giving mixed signals. And Michael, this is because they're also talking about a peace plan as well at the same time. And it's the Americans that have been saying they have evidence that they think China is going to be handing over weapons.
Xi Jinping is due to make a speech tomorrow, if it's not postponed. If not tomorrow, then probably Saturday. And it's called the Peace Speech. But I suspect we'll see it tomorrow or hear it tomorrow. And there is a peace plan which the Chinese intend to launch. Wang Yi, who is a prominent diplomat, is not foreign minister, but he's a very prominent spokesperson for the Chinese, has been in Moscow this week. And this peace plan, we'll see what it involves. I don't think it'll involve anything very surprising. But Brian is exactly right, that the Chinese are giving mixed signals. And it's interesting that Wang Yi, when he was in Moscow, he didn't use the phrase that Xi Jinping had used. He didn't say that this is a partnership without limits. That was his phrase that was picked up. He said the Chinese-Russian partnership is without limits. You would
without limits came from a year ago, didn't it, when Putin went to Beijing?
That's right, before this started. And Wang Yi did not repeat that, and that was an interesting omission. So he talked about a very strong partnership. I mean, there is a strong relationship between China and Russia because they're both revisionist powers. They both want to change the rules of the international system for their own different reasons. They're the two great revisionist powers in the world. That gives them a common interest over the long term.
Can I just interject there, Michael, because we have talked about this before, but they're not equal powers.
Not
I mean,
at all.
you know, is Russia in danger of becoming a client of China if they do accept any substantial aid?
Russia is moving into the position of being like North Korea, like a bigger problem, but a version of North Korea. I mean, just one indication. I mean, Russia is now selling its oil to China because it has to. It can't sell it to the Western world. It's selling it at $40 a barrel, which is about half the global price. It's on its knees in front of China at the moment because it needs it. And China's trade with Russia is about 3% of its total trade. I mean, most of China's trade is with Europe and North America. You know, its trade with Russia is tiny. And so Xi Jinping, he genuinely likes Putin, and Xi Jinping, you know, sees a commitment and he sees the need to uphold a front against America, against the Western world. But the war is doing China no good. And the prospect of Russia becoming a sort of a big version of North Korea really worries the Chinese.
So are the Chinese making a judgment then about what Russia can achieve? Let's ask the next question, because that kind of encapsulates as well. It's from John. He says, how likely is it now for China to become directly involved in the conflict, and what support would they provide? Well, first and foremost, arms and weapons.
That's what the Russians want. I mean, the Chinese have got vast stocks of ammunition that we were talking about, the artillery shells, but they've also got precision weapons, precision missiles, which the Russians are running out of. If the Chinese were prepared to open their arsenal to the Russians, then the Russians will not lose. That's the point. The Chinese could stop the Russians from losing, but the price to China will be very high indeed, because the Americans have made it really clear to China, you know, if you do this, A, we might supply a lot more weapons that you'd prefer we didn't, but secondly, there will be secondary sanctions. In other words, we will sanction your companies. The Chinese are really frightened of American sanctions. They've seen Western sanctions, and they couldn't believe how powerful they have turned out to be. We've been surprised by how powerful they've been. And they're really frightened of American sanctions being slapped on Chinese companies all over the world.
But it's also getting very geopolitical as well. Is another of the Chinese judgments about whether it hands over weapons and ammunition, their ambitions towards Taiwan. They're seeing what it takes, the Russian effort in Ukraine, which is not half as well armed as the Taiwanese are. And some American generals are saying they might have a go, the Chinese might have a go within the next 2 years. They need an awful lot of arms and equipment for that.
They might, but they've got 100 miles of water to cross, not just a couple of rivers. But if the Chinese try to solve their Taiwan problem by force, I'm pretty sure it won't be an invasion that suddenly starts one day. Almost certainly it would be a sort of series of political initiatives which create effectively a blockade of Taiwan, which gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And that would put the onus on the West. You know, when do you react? When do you actually start to try to break this blockade? So it would start with a trade issue, then it would be intercepting ships in the open sea or in an area that the Chinese claim is their territory, which it won't be, but they would claim it. And so it would be a sort of tightening noose to see how far they could push it before the West responded. So it wouldn't be a bolt from the blue attack, I'm fairly confident, but it would be a military response which gets more and more serious, which would pose the dilemmas for the West then.
Just underline that point you made earlier, you just touched on it, Michael. Juan asks this one, what would be the impact of China sending arms to Russia? I mean, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Do you think that, you know, if China went all in support of Russia, it would be over in Russia's favour?
Well, they could stop the Russians losing on the battlefield, so they could mean that the Russians could prevail. Given that the Russians are prepared to throw any numbers at this in terms of people, they're prepared for any set of casualties. If they had unlimited precision missiles and unlimited artillery, then the chances are they could conquer the areas they wanted to conquer. And then the Russians would have just left themselves with the small problem of a guerrilla war for the next 50 years. In a country of 44 million people.
This is a point you've made before, that if you conquer a country that isn't welcoming you as they thought a year ago, well, it's all very well winning a few battles, but then you try and actually control that country.
And your choices then is live with a guerrilla war and hope that you can keep it down to levels that you can live with, or suppress the country so much that you create a complete reign of terror. And again, a reign of terror in a country of 44 million people on the doorstep of Europe, surrounded by friendly countries, apart from Russia and Belarus, will be very difficult to do.
I've always wanted to ask that, though, Michael. I mean, there's quite a lot of territory the Russians have taken and hold, and, you know, we've seen them trying to transform cities like Mariupol. Is there any of that guerrilla activity taking place right now? Have we got any evidence of that behind so-called enemy lines?
Of guerrilla war?
Yeah, guerrilla warfare,
oh, yeah.
yes.
There is some, partisan warfare. It went on in Kherson. When the Russians had Kherson before they withdrew, there was quite a lot of it there. There was a huge clampdown. A lot of people were just taken away during the night. There was a lot of terror. And those attacks ceased for a while, but they've been springing up again, not now in Kherson, because that's back in Ukrainian hands, but Melitopol. There's lots of reports. That's under Russian control at the moment. There's lots of reports of partisan activity, but so far not so much of it that the Russians have got a big problem. But their Rosgvardia is there. This is their home defence force. There's 400,000 Rosgvardia numbers. The Rosgvardia, you know, internal troops, they're bigger than the army. The army was only 280,000. The Rosgvardia, directly responsible to Putin himself, only he is the commander, 400,000. And they've got Rosgvardia there, who are the Gestapo of the place. And they've got them there in very high numbers. And they're, as I say, in certain areas, they've created a dark Gestapo night on some of these cities.
OK, well, we're going to talk now about the risk of contagion, of a world war developing out of this. And earlier today, we heard from the Ukrainian Prime Minister.
If we assume that Ukraine could lose this war, it will be an extremely powerful signal for Russia and for any aggressor that it is possible to do this in a civilized world, and it will potentially cause many wars and possibly World War III.
Yeah, we heard it from the Ukrainian Prime Minister, possibly World War III. Let's put our next question on that to Professor Michael Clarke, an anonymous contributor, asking, in a war where neither side seems to be genuinely looking for peace, are there any mechanisms actually in place for stopping this escalating into something truly global? What are your thoughts?
Yes, there are. I mean, the chances of World War III are very, very remote. Because world wars are created, and they've been created twice in the 20th century, when big empires have global interests and pursue those interests all over the globe, and so they clash everywhere. And that's what First World War, Second World War became. And the Second World War was actually a series of 4 or 5 different wars that all coalesced into what we collectively call the Second World War. You can't create a scenario in which that genuinely happens. There's loads of novels out there on the station bookstores which have World War III titles. And I've read quite a lot of them. It's the connections between the conflicts that they're never convincing with. They can give you an outline of a conflict in the Middle East, a conflict in Southern Africa, a conflict in Europe. They never link up in the way that they did link up in the 20th century. Now, the mechanisms that, I mean, Mark Malloch Brown today, great United Nations official, retired, he was saying it's sad that the UN can't do more, and that's true. But the fact is that the mechanisms for stopping it escalating, in a sense, is the balance of power. It's the big countries that know that this war has got somehow to be fought through, but it has also got to be somehow contained. And it's not in their interest to let it go anywhere else. And certainly, Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, they don't want anything to do with it. The outcome of the war is terribly important to the world, but there's a determination that this is not about anything else than the conflict in Europe between an autocratic state and the liberal democracies who want to help it.
But could something be sparked? Let's put our next question by a scenario that Joe puts for us. There it is. Is American and UK involvement in the conflict pushing us closer to a world war? How much more help can we provide before Putin takes it as a direct attack on Russia? And this has been the case since the start of this conflict. This calculation taking place in Western capitals. Well, if we send this or that armament to Ukraine, how will that be interpreted by Russia? We seem to be moving beyond that point. But if it progresses further, and we talk, for instance, even about support ground crews, something like that, not necessarily combat forces, is there a danger that we end up with NATO and Russia actually coming into contact with each other?
That's the big red line that both sides recognise at the moment. And the Russians are behaving, despite what they say, and they come up with scare stories every day to try and frighten us into pushing the Ukrainians to stop. But the Russians recognise the red line, and we recognise the red line. I don't know quite why we all make such hard work of this, because it seems to be fairly simple. We can give the Ukrainians whatever weapons they need to prevail on the battlefield, because they're just trying to win back their territory. Everything they do with whatever systems is defensive, because they're trying to win back their territory. And all we've got to do is to say to the Ukrainians, you have to promise us that you won't use these long-range missiles to attack Russian territory directly. And the Ukrainians will give that promise, and we can believe it 100% for one obvious reason, that if the Ukrainians started to attack Russia directly, then they would lose the support of the West and they'd lose the war. The most suicidal thing the Ukrainians could do would be to take our long-range weapons and use them to attack Russia.
Okay.
That loses them the war. So I'm completely relaxed about the fact that they won't do it.
OK, well, I'm going to roll our next two questions together because you've kind of answered Mike's one, which asks, is it inevitable that this will become a full-scale war involving NATO? You think not. But Martin asks, what would a conventional war between Russia and NATO look like, and how safe would the UK be? We've talked on these programmes before about nuclear contact. We may touch on that a little later on in this session. But a conventional war, I mean, could it happen, and what form would it take? I mean, presumably, as you described, NATO tactics, which we're trying to teach to the Ukrainians, if NATO itself was employing them, NATO would win.
Yeah, and NATO, on paper, NATO is immensely stronger than Russia, immensely stronger in terms of numbers, manpower, air forces, everything. Now, NATO has been sort of hollowed out over the years. I mean, there's been a sort of structural disarmament going on throughout Western Europe since the end of the Cold War. And so defence policies have become more and more cheap, and we haven't kept up with it. But in the last 10 years, NATO, since the 2016 summit, the Wales summit, if you remember, 2014 Wales summit, there was a big sort of clarion call then, and NATO has made big efforts. NATO countries have made big efforts, not so much our own, but other countries have made big efforts to catch up on what they've lost. If you played out a war game at Trivenham, at our staff college, you say, all right, there's the Russian team, there's the NATO team, what happens? Other things being equal, Russia wouldn't stand a chance, conventionally.
Well, let's talk about unconventionally, and of course we're thinking of nuclear weapons, and the possible use of nuclear weapons has cast a shadow over this entire conflict almost since it began. In an address this morning, President Putin said that mass deliveries of hypersonic missiles we were discussing earlier are to be made to Russia's Navy as it enters a new state of battle readiness.
As before, we will pay increased attention to strengthening the nuclear triad. This year, the first launches of the Sarmat missile system with a new heavy missile enter combat duty. We will continue serial production of the Kinzhal air-launched hypersonic systems and begin mass deliveries of Zircon-C launched hypersonic missiles.
President Putin there talking about his hypersonic missiles, as discussed earlier with Professor Michael Clarke. And Stu asks this, Michael, do you see the possibility of a decisive victory for Ukraine where Russia accepts defeat without the use of nuclear weapons as a last resort? And this has always been the worry, isn't it? That if you defeat Russia on the battlefield, well, then they won't take it lying down and they'll use something tactical and nuclear.
That's possible. There's well, it's possible. I don't think it's barely possible, is what I would say. There's lots of other scenarios. One is that Putin is removed before this war is over, and that doesn't mean to say he'll be replaced by anybody more peaceful, because the people around him think the way he does, but at least it would be somebody different. And again, I don't have any problem talking about what the outcome would be. And it could be this. If Ukraine was successful, supposing they could throw Russia out of all the territories that they have conquered since February, and that's entirely plausible if they can get their act together this year. That's plausible. And we'd all say that was a good result, because then Putin's adventure will have failed. Possibly, they could throw Russia out of the territories they took in 2014 in the Donbass, and that leaves the issue of Crimea. Yeah. And what you do with Crimea, it's very simple. You say this is a really difficult issue. You give it to an international tribunal to look at, to adjudicate on. The tribunal sits for 40 years, comes up with nothing. It doesn't matter, because it takes it off the front line, and the rest of us get on with our lives in the meantime. That's what you do with international issues. I mean, it's the same with Northern Cyprus. Unresolved. So it goes to international discussion and everybody gets on with their lives. So nobody has to give anything. So the Ukrainians keep on claiming it. The Russians keep on saying it's intrinsically Russia for historical reasons, which is not true in international law, but they have a historical argument. And you argue around with a tribunal that meets once a month for 20 years, produces a report, everyone ignores it, but you've had 20 years break from worrying about it. And by then, who knows, the situation may be different.
But, I mean, isn't the danger in that scenario, the 20-year break is where everyone rearms and then and a new population grows up and you've got, you know, fresh troops to put into another battle?
It is the case that if this war ends, as it were, victoriously for the Ukrainians, if they get their territory back, all but Ukraine put on the shelf, they will still have to live with the idea that they will be a heavily armed state, because they're facing a Russia which, under present leadership and under present thinking in Russia, not just Putin, regards Ukraine as a non-state and somewhere that ought to be conquered. And so, I mean, the Ukrainians say this themselves. They say, we will be the Israel of Europe. We'll be the heavily armed state with a constant fear or constant danger of being eliminated by a neighbour. Now, the difference with Israel, in Ukraine's case, A, they wouldn't have a Palestinian problem issue, and B, they're not surrounded by hostile states, or states potentially hostile. They are surrounded by friends, apart from Belarus and Russia itself. So, but in one respect, yeah, the Israel of Europe is not unrealistic. I mean, the Ukrainians are in for a future of heavy armament and constant vigilance.
OK, so that's a point that might be reached, but let's end this session then with a question that asks, how might we get there? It's from Chris, who asks, I'm not sure we'll be able to get it up there in time, so I'll just read it out. Beyond the battlefield, what diplomacy will be going on directly between the major powers? I mean, you know, we don't know anything in terms of talks. We've known that, you know, Turkey's got involved in the past, individuals have got involved, Roman Abramovich. Are there any contacts? Are there any back channels between the major powers, between the United States, Russia and China?
Yeah, you bet there are. Yeah, they're going on all the time. I mean, I'm not going to, but I could name a couple of British individuals who are involved. I could name individuals in the Gulf who are involved. And sometimes they work on the side issues. I mean, there have been some prisoner exchanges that it suddenly appears one day, the exchange of prisoners. No build-up to it. It's all being worked on, generally speaking, by the International Committee on the Red Cross. Lots of things are happening. Refugee things are happening. But people are looking for areas in which they can have an arrangement between the two sides that suits them both. And prisoner exchanges are one of the areas that may be the case. So, yes, a lot of people in Europe and the wider world are trying to, as it were, excite their contacts on all sides, and a lot of Russians are doing this as well, to say, can we talk about this, can we talk about that? The diplomacy will stay private until such time as it can, as it were, come into the open as part of a bigger framework. But lots of people, I promise you, are looking for whatever linkages they can find, because some linkages are better than no linkages.
And is the point that building up those relationships, even if you're not talking originally about ultimate peace, they're important. Those are relationships. The fact you are talking, even if it's about something, call it mundane, it's important, of course. As a prisoner exchange, though, it's about the technicalities of it, but
absolutely.
you've got the contact.
Yeah, and in the business, it's called track 2 diplomacy. And sometimes in the Foreign Office, they talk about track 1.5 diplomacy. Track 1 is official diplomacy that's all written down and is available to the press afterwards and so on. Track 2 diplomacy is stuff that goes on that you don't talk to anyone else about. And track 2 diplomacy builds up the atmosphere which can then become track 1. So there is a lot of track 2 diplomacy going on.
Do you think it'll bear fruit? I mean, have you got confidence? We're talking about another year now in terms of the conflict. Do you think something diplomatic could happen before then?
Yes, it can bear fruit, and it's going on via China as well, remember, not just Russia and Europe. Yes, it can bear fruit, but not until the war takes a different turn. The offensives which are presently about to take place will play themselves out. They'll create some sort of new situation on the ground, and then, depending on what that situation is, there may be some sort of diplomacy that's possible. I'll tell you what could be possible. Supposing the Russians are able to surround Kiev, they won't take it, but say they could surround it and threaten Kiev, and supposing the Ukrainians are able to threaten Crimea with their new offensive, then both sides might say, OK, let's talk, because there'd be a sort of a symmetry there that might provide the base, at least for a ceasefire. But I have to say, before that diplomatic framework would become possible, sadly, there's a great deal of dying to do yet.
Michael, as ever, it's been fantastic getting your expertise there. Thank you very, very much indeed for sharing so much of it with us. Professor Michael Clarke there. Coming up next, much more on the first anniversary of the attack on Ukraine.